Hey, thanks for clicking on the video. Before we start, though, liking the Imperium doesn't make you bad. I love the Imperial Guard. If rooting for the baddies implied support of that baddie's policies, we'd have to pin Disney as the largest pro-totalitarianist hedge fund in America. I say this because internet discourse is
hive of scum and villainy. We must be cautious.
Also, just a content warning, since 40k lives up to its description as the grimdark setting. I'll be discussing fascism, obviously, but it's also worth mentioning that violence, abuse, genocide, and so forth will be touched upon. But if you still don't want to go there, I get it. Let's begin. I got into Warhammer 40k when I was about 15. The lore interested me, and the aesthetics inspired me. But I fell deep down the lore rabbit hole more than I ever did the models, despite spending over $700 on the fuckers. But throughout the entire time, there was something interesting being discussed, at least on my corner of the 40k world. Namely, how to reconcile the fact that most folks despised the Imperium's politics, but fell in love with it. There's a lot you could bring up to justify it. For example, I love the Imperial Guard story. The humans, lone, regular humans, standing up with nothing but a rifle and flak armor against the horrors of the galaxy. But most heroes of the Guard are commissars, enforcers of Imperial ideology. You could also just straight up love the aesthetics or the joy of playing the game, but the rulebooks are written mostly as lore with some stuff in the back, meaning you kinda have to contend with it. And at least when I play, there are spirited discussions of the lore happening in the game stores. And that lore presents the Imperium as a brutal, totalitarian, theocratic state that purges dissenters and cracks planets into dust. My views on this have evolved a lot, but I came to the understanding that the Imperium of Man is actually a pretty interesting take on fascism. It portrays the world in which the protagonists are validated in their beliefs, and those beliefs are fascistic ideas, but it does not claim that fascism is a morally correct system. So there's my argument. Let's get to proving it. I'm first going to go through a brief explanation of the lore of Warhammer 40k, specifically the Imperium, both for newcomers and for fans who might not have much love of the Imperium, but mostly for myself because I love aimless ranting. If you don't want to hear that, there's a timestamp flashing up now. Part 1. An insultingly brief overview of history. Warhammer 40k has two distinct settings in it. The 30k setting and the 40k setting. The 30k setting follows the Emperor and his getting dunked on by Horus. But the 30k setting is the modern, extreme scare quotes, setting. Since they're one history, I'm just going to go through it all here. So the Age of Strife begins because Chaos decides to fuck the galaxy with a new hole, and it broke a human empire into thousands of little pieces, including Earth, which lost all of its water because some dipshit pulled the big plug from the Marianas Trench out, and it becomes a Mad Max hell world. A man named the Emperor, a big chunker of a person with psychic powers, a class of people called Psychers in 40k, shows up with an army of genetically modified soldiers known as the Thunder Warriors. He takes over Earth and the Moon and signs a deal with the Tech Priests of Mars. The Emperor believes in the Imperial Truth, an ideology that combines the aesthetics of Christian faith with a doctrine of pragmatics and rationalism, and a good dose of totalitarianism, while never really trying to reconcile the contradictions.
But let's discuss the contradiction.
He goes around, blows up churches, and is generally being a 14-year-old atheist who reads way too much Dawkins and skims way too much Nietzsche to take others seriously or treat them with compassion. Before his reconquest of Earth, he was trying to grow his own boys, but they were thrown across the galaxy by chaos and landed on different planets, and so he used the genetic templates of his sons, called Primarchs, to create the Space Marine Legions who replaced the Thunder Warriors. The Space Marines and the Emperor go on a great crusade and find the Primarchs and reconquer the galaxy in the name of mankind. They find the Primarchs and do a lot more genocide on the way. They kill almost every human faction they come across, from the scummy who legitimately deserve it, like the Black Judges who feed on the living to prolong their own lives, to the chummy who don't deserve it, like the Interrex, who lived alongside aliens and understood chaos, protected their people from chaos, while letting them know it still existed. By contrast, the Imperium hid the knowledge of chaos, and the Emperor specifically condemned supernatural explanations for obviously supernatural events. The Primarchs, now bickering with each other, end up splitting after a few of them start to believe the Imperium is doomed because one of them sees visions of the Emperor worshipped as a god. This is called the Horus Heresy, and there's like 9,000 books on it. Basically, the Emperor forms the Inquisition, the secret police, does a bunch of other stuff, gets stabbed, murders his son, and the Primarchs all die in various means, and we get what kind of becomes the 40k setting. The Imperial Truth has long been abandoned for a religious version, the Imperial Cult, still preaching the innate superiority of mankind and the right for humans to manifest their destiny across the entire galaxy. It's evolved from a state that is fascist but atheistic to a state that's fascist but theocratic. It's defended by the Space Marines, golden boys of the setting, they're packaged on everything, the Inquisition, brutal secret police who are able to blow up entire planets, and the Imperial Guard, the human army that consists of basically throw men at the problem until it stops tactics. The entire setting has recently been turned upside down when a planet called Cadia fell, causing the entire galaxy to split down the middle. One Primarch, Robot Gulaman, whose name is ever unpronounceable, recently woke up with what was thought to be a coma he could never return from, and he's currently working with the theocratic authorities while also trying to work his own plans. It's all very fucked, though. Part 2. The Imperium as a fascist organization. So, now that we're this far into the video, time to address why I'm specifically calling the Imperium fascist. Leftists like me are often stereotyped as calling everything fascist, so I'm going to lay down the definitions I'm using. I'll be addressing this question using Umberto Eco's 14 points of ur-fascism and Rodger Griffin's concept of palingenetic ultranationalism, the latter of which I will explain after I go through Eco. For those of you who don't know, Eco was a scholar who grew up in fascist Italy, and under the belief that fascism kind of always was bubbling under the surface of society, he wrote about generic or ur-fascist ideas. Intentionally, the ideas are both broad and vague, where he specifically lays out what he considers the points to be, but the points themselves can manifest in multiple different ways. In essence, it's sort of a Rorschach test for fascism. The same ink is there, but different people will interpret the specific image differently. He did this because he did not think that Mussolini would come back from the grave and be a new neo-fascist, but some new, less obvious form of fascism would come. It would be based on similar rhetoric, similar ideas, and similar goals, but different expressions based on the specific idea, culture, and time period it emerged in. Even in contemporary times, German fascism was very different from Italian fascism, which was very different from British fascism. All of them had their origins in specific circumstances, but all of them could be called fascist. Link to ur-fascism is in the description. I'll also post a full explanation of what I think of the points of Eco in relation to 40k down in the comments, but indulge me as I go through a few here. So he starts out with a syncretic culture. A syncretic culture is a cult of tradition that claims the truth has already been revealed and it's up to us to find it. This extends into the contradictions, where each contradiction is an expression of that primal truth. This permits fascism to have a deeply contradictory ideology where they'll say praise the Spartans, the Norse, and the Crusaders all at the same time, as if there's any continuity between those groups. They'll wave away these contradictions with a put-put and, don't think about it too much, but they're still there. As I mentioned before, for example, the Imperium's initial ideology, the Imperial Truth, is full of contradictions. It's rationalistic, but denies obvious reality of chaos being supernatural. It's atheistic, but wants you to trust in the institutions as if they're divine. It wants to have progress in science, while also being totalitarianist and narrowing the confines of free thought in such a way where you can't really express any ideas that go against the main narrative, which kind of goes against the whole idea of science, you know? Sometimes it reveals inconvenient things. It retains many of these characteristics later on as well, but in a sort of Uno reverse card sense, where the Imperial cult worships the divine even though it has its origins in atheism, and claims lineage with the Emperor even though the Emperor would despise everything the Imperial cult has become. This sort of culture results in anti-intellectualism and irrationality, an embrace of action for its own sake, and a disdain of thinking of and criticism of culture. After all, while all cultures have things that might not make sense, fascist culture has direct, actual contradictions that are untenable. Echo, for example, pointed out that claiming the makers of Stonehenge and St. Augustine, both belonging to the glorious legacy of the West, is sort of a contradiction, because those two have nothing in common with each other, and one of them wasn't even born in Europe. But if you're willing to ignore those contradictions, you can still claim they represent something deeper. And of course, in the context of 40k, you can condemn psychers and the use of psychic powers as sorcery, while also claiming the supernatural doesn't exist. This sort of action for its own sake also appears within the armies of the Imperium, with glory being heaped upon combat, as opposed to any sort of diplomacy. There's also the idea that acting for its own sake, acting for the Emperor, and dying for the Emperor are innate goods, which brings me to the concept of the cult of heroes. The cult of heroes, or as Umberto put it, everyone being educated to be a hero, is the idea that heroism and putting your life in danger would be expected of every single individual. It takes the idea of heroism and the idea that most people have, that putting your life on the line is noble, and turns it into an expected trait of everyone. After all, fascists also believe that life is lived for eternal struggle and that pacifism is unnatural. War must be fought, and it must be fought by everyone. No one can sit back and let others be heroes. Death is coming, and while a non-fascist society might say that death is unpleasant, but must be faced with dignity, fascist societies glorify dying for their cause, glorify dying for their leader. You just have to look at the imperial rhetoric to see this. There's thousands of little quips and quotes you can find of various people talking about how good it is to die for the Emperor, and in fact, death for the Emperor is seen as just another way to serve him. For example, the Space Marines, when fatally wounded, will sometimes be put into a mechanical life support device called dreadnoughts, where they, as reward for their sacrifice, are permitted to serve the Emperor even more in a robotic body. These are core aspects of Imperial ideology, and so I think it very quickly fits into the idea Echo had about the cult of heroes. All of this as well is coupled with a fear of diversity, an extreme us versus them that takes natural human tribalism and extends it to the extremes of hatred and fear, with any sort of dissent being seen as part of a vast conspiracy and plot. After all, when you are creating this supremacist version of the world, where your people are at the top, you gotta explain why you have been brought low. In this case, it's because everyone who is against your specific vision is destroying you. It's this eternal obsession with a plot where both outsiders and collaborators from the in-group are working in order to destroy everything that the in-group and the rightful master race has built up. It's a case where there's an eternal enemy always plotting against you, and dissent from the fascist ideal is invariably seen as support for the plot. In essence, disagreement is heretical and seen as a direct opposition to the powers that be. The Imperium has an obsession with the plots of chaos and heretics, apostates and aliens, and constantly accuses anyone who goes against it to be a member of those groups. And while there is some wiggle room for the specific cultural areas of the Imperium, it still ultimately has series of lines that cannot be crossed, because the moment you cross them, you've rescinded your humanity and joined the plot. Though those are just the points I wanted to go through, though. Also, just to say this and get it out of the way, just because the Imperium doesn't get every single person it declares a heretic, and just because it makes compromises or its most powerful people sometimes go against the rules, doesn't mean it's actually not fascist. Rogue traitors and inquisitors are not evidence against it being a non-fascist society, because fascist societies are not actually organized top-down perfect orders. They're full of squabbling and underhanded ideas and dealings. They are corrupt as shit and full of backstabbers. People with enough money and influence tend to be free from the powers that be. Don't believe me? Look up what Mussolini did with Gabriele D'Annunzio and the inner workings of the Nazi Party. The rivalries and backstabbings were real, and even if they were all devoted to a central figure, they hated each other. Just because the Imperium doesn't have the resources or ability to keep a chokehold on every single planet, doesn't mean calling it fascist is wrong. Otherwise, every single group that failed to come to power, that subscribed to fascist ideals, could not be called fascist. It's a system of beliefs and ideas. Its ability to put those ideas into idealistic practice is kind of secondary. That's all well and good, but it also comes to a point where we need to ask, what's the point? Why does fascism manifest itself? What's its purpose and its goal? Its raison d'etre? An ideology as extreme as fascism has to emerge from somewhere, right? Well, Echo posited there was a sense of shame. The idea that you were cowed and made low. Rodger Griffin agreed and came up with the idea of palingenetic ultranationalism. And to quote from Innuendo Studios, it's a wonderful term because it compresses many ideas into 2 words, but a terrible term because both terms need definitions. Both scholars attribute to fascism a deep sense of shame and humiliation, and not the fun type either, but a deep national humiliation that must be rectified in a palingenesis, or a rebirth. Palingenesis has some real religious, apocalyptic overtones. Its other uses tend to be in describing reincarnation or a remade universe after a final judgment. In fascist thought, though, when a nation has been laid low by some real or perceived enemy, it can only be restored by ultranationalism, a delirious, passionate pride in one's own nation, where the nation is put above all, and you take to destroying anyone and anything outside of the nation or critical of the nation and the regime that promises that rebirth. Through this, like the phoenix, the nation is reborn and glory is restored. This promise of glory, this ultimate palingenesis, is the promise that fascists make to people, to justify all their other ideas. In the context of 40k, because this video is still about that, humanity is cowed after the Age of Strife, and it's up to the Emperor to restore the glory of humanity. Never mind that a lot of humanity is doing pretty okay for itself, it must be under the banner of the Imperium. If you're not down with that, you're an outsider. You're no longer human. You will be destroyed as a heretic. The Emperor attributes to himself the sole ability to become that palingenetic actor, to bring that myth of palingenesis into reality and make everything right and good and golden. He even says that his entire quest is basically to destroy chaos itself, destroying the main enemy of humanity, uniting all of humanity under one banner, and having an eternal galaxy under the reign of mankind forevermore. And the imperial truth is an atheistic justification for a palingenetic ultranationalist vision of the world. The imperial cult is a religious version of the same promise. But you may have noticed something about what I said earlier, about the obsession with the plot, the eternal heroism, and the cult of death. Isn't the setting sort of validating all of that? Doesn't Warhammer 40k create a world in which the enemies really are eternal, where peace really isn't an option, where the ideology of the Imperium can kind of get the mark right? Is the Imperium right? Part 3. Is the Imperium right? So, here's the thing. The Imperium of Man is largely validated in its belief system in the text of Warhammer 40k. There really is an eternal enemy of all sapient life. Several of them, actually. And there are enemies with whom you cannot work with, who cannot be reasoned with. Let's take the orcs, for example, the goodest boys of the setting.
Orcs plague the whole galaxy from end to end, with their ceaseless warring and strife. They are a warlike, crude, and highly aggressive green-skinned Xenos race, organized in a primitive and brutal society, rooted so deeply in war that peace is utterly incomprehensible to them.
Could not have said it better myself. The whole point of the orcs is that they are incredibly violent, and the way they're described is a weird mix of hooliganism and unending violence. In fact, they are described in a very succinct way as committing a mix of holy war and pub crawls whenever they go to war. So, the orcs zoom on up, land on your planet, and start murdering everyone. What's the reasonable response? Diplomacy? No, they're using the diplomat's head as a football. Evacuating the planet? Maybe, but their daca has darkened the sun. The solution is that everyone is a hero. There's no distinction between soldier and civilian because there can't be. Pick up a gun and hope to the Emperor that you see tomorrow, because even if tomorrow is just all this over again, at least you'll be alive. Chaos can only enter reality when the space between the two realities, that of the Materium and the Immaterium, is thin or even broken. This can happen because of random fluctuations in the warp. In ships which enter the warp for faster than light travel, a magical hell world doesn't obey relativity, or whenever a psyker uses their powers and lets their guard down. Chaos is literally always plotting against the Imperium, and against all sentient life in fact, and it will not stop. In large part because there's scant few other options, many who turn away from the Imperium join Chaos, and Chaos is able to really easily infiltrate the networks of the Imperium. But I think that for the Imperium to be considered morally and ideologically correct, it would not only need to produce the proper responses to our ideas, but to the setting's social pressures, and to also actively work in a way that reaches its goals. Both its ultimate goal, that palingenesis, and the smaller goals of pacifying planets and creating a docile population, fulfilling the Emperor's vision, and so forth. To be clear, I'm not talking about rightness in the real world, but rightness in a setting where writers can produce any outcome they want and bend reality in any twisted way they want to say what they want to say. And the Imperium's great visionary died. He's a rotting corpse on a too large throne. His Inquisition does not advance his agenda because his agenda was mostly secret, but has also been so corrupted that if he ever woke up, he'd burn it all down. Not to say he wasn't fascistic before, but the ideology of the Imperium has changed into something he openly disdained. Everything that was set out to be done has failed, and the Imperium is moving forwards not towards a palingenesis, but to a stagnation, where for 10,000 years, nothing has changed but having more enemies to fight. Progress is actively discouraged, and political dissent tends to end in assassinations or excommunications. Even the son of the Emperor, Robot, that Primarch I mentioned earlier, has to contend and work within the systems of power, because he's not seen as the legitimate authority. The high vision of the Emperor above everyone else that has been essentially made and cut from whole cloth to justify what the Imperium is doing is considered the highest authority. The Imperium isn't correct. It failed to get what it wanted. It failed to restore a golden age for humanity. It failed to stop chaos. It currently fails to do anything but sacrifice millions to win wars against smaller or weaker enemies via attrition, and against larger enemies by sheer firepower. All it's done is survive, and barely even that. There have been civil wars in ages where the Imperium has been collapsing, and none of the attempts of the various dictators and wannabes has restored mankind to that palingenetic rebirth. Sure, the Imperium is the foremost power in the galaxy, but it's there because it's so callous towards its own citizens, because it's willing to expend millions, because it's ceased to do anything but exist. Its response to the issues of the world is good enough to keep itself going, but not good enough to advance. Contrasted with the Tau Empire, God, I'm going to get so much hate for that. A small empire run by a caste system. It's not great. It's a military autocracy run by an elite oligarchy. It opens its borders to friendly nations, though. It has systems for dealing with unfriendly ones, and while they do extend the olive branch too quickly, they've had more successes than failures. In fact, they even have humans in their society who are permitted to worship the Emperor so long as the xenophobia isn't front and center. They're not great, but they're not a fascist society, and they've expanded their empire and have fought the Imperium to a draw or a costly victory more than once. There have been cases where the writers of Games Workshop have tried to lurch them towards the grimdark, but they're still better than the Imperium and show a different system of rule. One that allows collaboration, one that permits advancement. They exist as an intentional contrast to the Imperium, to show that the Imperium isn't the only way forwards. The thing is that Warhammer 40k never lets us forget that the Imperium is in a hell of its own making. The Chaos Gods feed on emotion, and the Imperium relies on whipping up emotional crowds to commit ultraviolence. Khorne, god of violence, feeds on death no matter who dies. Even an imperial victory over chaos is a victory for Khorne. The exterminatory policies of the Imperium mean every time they can get help from the aliens, they refuse it, save in dire circumstances where refusing it means the destruction of both parties. That status quo of constant war means the Imperium loses billions of young men and women to pointless expansionism that does not improve the status of anyone but the top. When the Imperium takes over, they impose their faith, steal men and women for the army, and do nothing for the average citizens. There are planets in the Imperium called feral worlds, intentionally left to be absolutely nothing but hell, even though the Imperium has the technology to help them, because of this weird social Darwinist theory that they'll make better space marines if they live in the hell for a few years beforehand. There are other options though. There are better options though. The Imperium of Man is based on a promise that was never to be fulfilled, and it does nothing but survive. It isn't right. It's a wrong, failing state, and that is fucking beautiful. The Imperium will never win, because it can't win, because its policies are such where if it tries to move and tries to advance, it will break apart into civil war. It is just biding time, and even though it's lasted 10,000 years, nothing short of a total reformation and abolishment of the current imperial system will save it. Part 4. Money and Misinterpretation. Originally, this part was going to be a brief discussion of my overall point. But instead, as I was editing the audio, I found something. On my Tumblr blog, I found an old archived link to a post by a now defunct neo-Nazi organization known as the Traditionalist Youth Network. It was a part of the Traditionalist Workers' Party, a group recognized as neo-fascist that fell apart after internal controversy. I read the post, and a lot of things clicked for me. This post is wrong for a lot of reasons. It describes the Tau as communist, it says they're a hive mind, it presents the Imperium as an unquestioned good, its citizens are willing or happy, and so forth. It's bad lore, bad lore, bad lore. Nothing but bad lore. Doesn't even seem like the dude read anything outside 4chan posts about 40k on /TG. He makes a few points that progressive 40k fans had actually been complaining about. He praises the fact there's no non-white people, for example. But he gets to something I was having trouble expressing. Warhammer 40k validates the rhetoric of these people, and also dismantles it, but not intentionally. Rick Priestley, one of the people recognized as creating 40k, claims that he created the setting as an intentional parody of organized dogmatic faith, specifically Christian faith. Buddhism didn't inspire the Imperium, so even if he doesn't say it's inspired by Christianity specifically, it's safe to assume that's what he had in mind. But the draw of Warhammer 40k is the minis and the game. It earned a reputation as being the grimmest and darkest and most edgy setting out there. The thing is that when you make that your brand, you sort of prioritize that, right? Like, if you're making money hand over fist because some guy comes into your store to buy boxes of the guys with massive guns, then having a multitude of stories to tell them about the guy with a massive gun is an advantage. The lovely people at my local game store sold me on various things by telling me the 40k stories, and the different books are mostly lore in order to make you think the faction is cool. To be clear, everyone who works at my friendly local game store is cool. Everyone that I played with is cool. But the process I described of telling stories creates a sort of loop where, because you need extreme stuff to look cool, you write more extreme stuff. If you have one super popular faction, that faction will get the brunt of the writing devoted to it, and that faction will of course become even more popular. Eventually, though, your setting, where the obvious lies and deeply satirical tone are center stage, may start to lose that, and the tone and lies will take a back seat to the cool stories and awesome aesthetics. And eventually, you're going to find some people who don't get the point. If you want to see a more in-depth look into fascism and why fascists might like 40k, the YouTuber Salamander is going to be releasing a video. The link will be above when it's out. But Games Workshop doesn't really care. People like the writer of this article, again, are a minority view. It might be the only minority they're a part of, but either way, as long as they don't bring their open hatred into the store, Games Workshop will take their money. Games Workshop is too incurious about the end result of Imperial ideology. Its stories give far more weight to the Space Marines than their victims, far more attention to the Inquisitors than their piles of bodies. We rarely get a common man's perspective, and I think that's kind of intentional. A common person's story in 40k is often far too bleak. The kind of reflective works I'd like to see in 40k do exist. For example, Caiaphas Cain is a somewhat lighthearted series that nonetheless criticizes the Imperium in the form of a commissar's journal being censored and added to by an Inquisitor. The game that I've been playing a lot of footage of, Space Marine, has an extremely interesting subplot about the contrast between traditionalism and pragmatism that ultimately comes to the conclusion that pragmatism is far more important than traditionalism. But at the end of the day, Games Workshop is guided by money. When they posted this image, it was, I don't know. The thing is I guess I like it. Warhammer 40k's take on fascism is incredibly interesting, and I believe that Warhammer 40k and Games Workshop retains that critical element somewhere, and I am fully willing to chalk up the trad youth assholes to just some person not getting the message. But I guess the question is, where was the wiggle room? Did 40k care more about the money that they were getting, or sending the clear message? The reason the war in 40k is unending is because they won't get money if it ends. Peace is not profitable in a war game. The Tau and the Eldar and the Orcs play second fiddle to the Imperium, because if they didn't, they wouldn't sell as much. The Imperium sells more and always will. The reason the setting is so dark is because if it isn't, it loses its identity. I don't know what those Marvel comics will be like, but I suspect they'll play up the blood and gore and violence, but not have much of a point or message or idea driving it. I hope I'm wrong, but I think it'll be violence for its own sake. Action for the sake of action. Warhammer 40k stumbles into the brilliant observation that fascism can never win, because it will always find a new enemy. Its faith, its militant zeal, its willingness to spend the lives of millions, all of that is just in service to a war they can't win. If they did wipe out every Xenos race, they'd wage war against chaos. If they won against chaos, I'm certain they'd turn on each other. After that, who knows? There is no point where a society like the Imperium, a society that is fascist, where you are able to put down your gun. If there was, the citizens, long under the jackboot, would rise up and the society would not remain fascist or united for very long. There is no palingenesis, because the proposed methods of getting there are not the way to the stable society. The war is eternal, never-ending, and against all enemies, real and perceived. In the end, fascism will end in the cruelest, most bloody regime imaginable. I just don't know how seriously Games Workshop takes that. Thank you for watching. This video took a while to make, I know. Like, comment, subscribe. If you're feeling extremely generous, join my Patreon. They're scrolling by right now, and they're lovely people, one and all.